Alright, what is it guys? My name is Brian and I work for the artist name of Cloophie. So, just telling you guys straight up, you guys are in for a treat today. Last video, I mentioned that for this video, we're going to be covering mixing, mastering, and just pretty much the final stages of production. Truthfully speaking, I don't have that much experience or knowledge in that field. So, I also mentioned that we're going to be having a special guest featuring on this channel today, and I'll tell you guys who that is in a little bit. You guys will see for yourself. But before we get into that, I just kind of want to give you guys a breakdown of how this video is going to go. I briefly checked out the footage that he sent over. You know, it's very insightful and thorough. And so that being said, I don't want to cut it short. Pretty much here's the plan. For this video, I'm going to be reacting to what he sent over. Kind of just pausing in the middle, explaining to you guys what I think about what he's saying. And the next video is going to be me actually putting those tips into use, trying them out, and then just showing you guys what I think about it. That means there's not going to be any music production, making processes, I don't know, whatever, in this video. But I still feel like you guys should really watch this video thoroughly, because chances are these are really golden tips. You know, it's coming from a guy who clearly knows what he's doing. So I'm really just excited to share what he has to say with you guys as well. But yeah, without further ado, I bring to you Mondo Loops.
What's up, Cloophie? Thanks for inviting me to be on the channel. I'm a huge fan of your videos, love your lo-fi content, and your music is insane, so it's a real honor to be featuring on one of your videos. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Antonio. I'm a producer in the lo-fi scene, and I go by the alias of Mondo Loops. So yeah, I'm going to try and go over the process of mixing and mastering a lo-fi track, just throwing a few tips and tricks that could help you on the way. So in general, mixing and mastering lo-fi is pretty similar to how you'd approach any other genre, but there's a few little intricacies and tricks that apply more to lo-fi than anything else, so I'll go over them as well. To start off with the mixing, my tip number one would be to keep on top of the mixing as you go. So for me, I record a lot of guitar, upright piano, some bass, other instruments. And if you're recording live instruments, you can often get some resonance and unwanted frequencies. You can still get it with VSTs as well, but often VSTs are a little bit more fine-tuned, so it might not be as much of a problem. But if you're recording live instruments, you're definitely going to want to keep on top of the mixing as you go. So if I record, for example, a guitar progression, I find that often they'll get some sort of low mid resonance. So it's best to try and tame that early. That can be by using tools such as Soothe.
Okay, I'm gonna pause real quick. Yeah, but what he's saying makes sense, right? And I feel like in a way, this might actually help with the arrangement process as well, because if you mix as you go, and by mixing, it's like adjusting the volumes of each instrument or each pattern to each other, right? So if you adjust as you go, then you might probably get a better idea of what needs to be placed in certain places of the song. So yeah, because usually I feel like you guys have noticed that I make one huge pattern, split that, and then just end up arranging. And that's where my biggest problem is, right? Like I get lost trying to figure out how to progress the song. So I feel like that's a pretty good tip actually.
Which is a great way to sort of dynamically EQ a track. Or you can use stock effects like EQs, compressors, and multiband compression could be a great tool for this as well. So if you record something, make sure that there's no harsh resonance, EQ it out, throw a compressor on there to control the dynamic range, and just make sure that your mix is quite tidy and clean as you go. And I guess another part of that would be when you start a track, and lo-fi producers often make this mistake, it's if you're making like a sleepy, mellow, minimal track, you might start by writing a really soft chord progression. But you have to try and reference that against something. So if you start off really quiet, everything else you make in the mix is going to be super quiet. And then when you get to the mix and master final stages, you're going to find that your levels are just way too low. And then if you crank them up, you might start to get distortion. So I would recommend having a sort of level reference for each track when you start. So a lot of VSTs, as was the situation with analog gear, have a sort of target volume to get the most out of the VSTs or the hardware, which is usually peaking around minus 18 decibels. So when I'm starting a track, I'm trying to make everything sort of peak around that mark. It gives you plenty of headroom when it comes to mastering, and it means that you're not too quiet and you're not going to sort of get any weird artifacts when you start pushing stuff.
I'm gonna pause again. So what he's saying now is, since you're mixing as you go, you should also keep your volume in check, right? And I feel like this actually is pretty true because I've been using a lot of samples recently from Splice, and what I've noticed is that the samples are always pretty loud compared to when I create patterns from scratch from my own plugins, right? So that can definitely happen, what he's saying about when you finish creating that pattern, you notice that the final volume is way lower than that 0 mark, right? Which is what you should be aiming for in the end. So yeah, I'm actually guilty of what he said not to do, which is cranking up that master channel way up at the end. And okay, so that's another good tip from him. And then let's keep going.
Through a higher volume. So that's tip number 1. Manage the mix as you go and make sure your levels are set in the right ballpark. It's not an exact science. It can be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but just try and keep it consistent. And then when it does get to the final mixing stage, different producers have different ways of approaching this. But for me, I think the best way to do it is to sort of zone in on your main element of the track. So that could be the drums, it could be the piano chord progression, whatever it may be. Start off with that solo and isolation. So for me, if it was a guitar progression that sort of carries through the track, I'd solo that, make sure that there's no unwanted frequencies and resonance, make sure the level was all right. And then from there, I'd start to bring in other elements. So that you can bring in whatever the next most important thing is. It could be the lead or the bass, and just make sure you're bringing stuff in to compare it to your sort of key element. So I slowly bring in more elements, making sure they all match with each other level wise, and that way you've got a reference point and a sort of clear target when I'm controlling the levels of different instruments in the track. And then once you've done that for every track, you'll have a really nicely volume balanced mix. And from there you can sort of add your final improvements and enhancements. So that could be adding some stereo width, moving stuff left and right in the panning, adding saturation and distortion to sort of enhance the harmonics, or maybe use some compression to control the dynamics. And just give it a nice big stereo field, make sure it's nice and bright and you're sort of covering a nice balanced spectrum on the EQ. And a couple of lo-fi specific things.
Okay, before he keeps going on, so he kind of touched bases on arrangement parts real quick. So he's still trying, I think what he's trying to say is, you know, he's still bringing that point of mixing as you go, which is in the end going to lead to that final volume that you want, right? But he also mentioned that you're going to start off with mixing or mastering that initial pattern, right? Which relates to what we talked about in the first video, which is creating that foundation, right? Creating that first pattern so that you can add the other patterns on top of that. So I guess how I would relate what he's saying to the videos that I've been showing you are create that first pattern, make sure the volume is where you want it, and then as you create those other melodies that I keep talking about in the other videos, just keep leveling them together to make sure that, you know, nothing's too harsh, right? And so let's say you create that first pattern, and then you're going to want to start bringing in the most important element after the first pattern, which is probably going to be like the melody, to introduce the listeners to what the main melody is, right? So you bring in the foundation, you bring in the melody, you keep mixing, and then you start slowly bringing in the other elements, and, you know, just keep that level going. All right, let's keep going.
I hear a lot, especially with newer producers, is number 1, just because it's lo-fi doesn't mean you've got to completely flood the track with heavy atmosphere, vinyl crackle, birds tweeting, whatever it might be. Make sure that that's a sort of nice element that adds depth and texture in the lo-fi feel, but make sure it's not ruining your mix. So if you've got vinyl crackle, usually if you just drag and drop a vinyl sample from online, it's going to have a really muddy sort of low end that's not going to add much to your track at all. So you can most of the time just cut out all of the sort of low mids, and on top of that, make sure it's not sort of harsh. If you use like isotope vinyl and just drop that in, it's going to be super harsh and unpleasant. So try and find some nice soft crackly warm sounds that add depth to your mix without destroying the sort of balance of it.
Okay, so this is actually really cool that he mentions this, because I feel like this kind of relates to what I've been thinking recently about lo-fi changing trends. So lo-fi, like even a couple of years ago, used to be very sample-y and vinyl crackle heavy, actually, I think, in my opinion. You have pretty much one pattern, some boom bap drums, and just a lot of vinyl crackle or rainy noise going along with it. But nowadays, it's kind of turned into a more sleepy vibe, which means you're gonna want to cut out that vinyl crackle and that rain noise a little bit. You might have it in the intro, but once the main song part starts going, like, I think it's trendy now to take it away a little bit. So that's another good point by him. He clearly knows what he's doing because he's one of the leader at the times. So this makes sense. All right, let's keep going.
And my last quick point would be, if you're going to use sort of lo-fi pitch shifting effects, so like tape wobble and warp and stuff like that, use it quite conservatively. I often hear people throwing like RC20 on full whack to different tracks, and it can make the track sound a bit unpleasant if used incorrectly. Obviously, it throws the pitch a bit to get that wobbly effect, and if you're doing that too much, you're going to get clashing in instruments.
Okay, so quick point. Remember how I said about blending the sounds in together, using that reverb, using that delay to make sure it's soft hitting. One of the reasons why I recommend you guys using soft sounds is exactly what he said, because lo-fi effects are sometimes seen as just, pure warble, high EQ, and if you do that too much, it's going to clash, which doesn't go along with what we were talking about earlier also, right? So yeah, quick point there.
And it's just not going to work. So be mindful of that as well. So onto my actual mastering chain that I'm using at the minute. I know a lot of producers have got different ways of approaching the mastering chain as well. Some tweaks to order of the effects and stuff like that. But the way I do it is, firstly, I start off with my sort of EQing section, or controlling the spectrum section. So I start off by making sure that the low end, the subs and the basses are mono where I want them to be. This can vary track to track. Sometimes I might make it mono up to sort of 300-400 hertz. If it needs to, but most of the time I'll just make sure that anything below 150 hertz, 100 hertz is monoed, just to keep it clean and not too messy. And then from there, I'll start to control the resonance on the track. So looking for any frequencies that are a little bit harsh or adding muddiness to the track that I can tame. At that point, I'll do so. So a tool that I use to do that is Soothe, but you can do it with stock EQs and automation as well if you want it to EQ certain parts of the track and not others. But with Soothe, you don't have to worry about any of that. You can focus in on certain sections of the mix and it will control the resonance as and when it becomes an issue. So it's a great tool to have for mixing, but certainly not essential. From there, another tool that I use is Gulfot, which again is it's a similar sort of dynamic EQ, but less specifically focusing in on resonance, more a sort of general overview. So it's certain sections, if it's a little bit harsh on the highs, it will generally chop off the highs a little bit. And it's got functionality to adjust sort of what areas you want to focus on, if you want to recover the low end or reduce the low end, whatever it may be. Another great tool to have, but again, not essential. From there, I use a bit of saturation. Generally, I'll add a bit of saturation to the top end if it's sounding a little bit muffled and I want some more interesting harmonics in the top end. There's various tools you can use to do that. Again, FL Studio, Ableton, Logic have all got their own saturation tools. So I'll try and do that more on the high end just to add a little bit of sort of brightness to it. But yeah.
I never thought about using saturation. You almost wouldn't think that he uses it considering how soft and just like pure sounding his melodies are. So that's an interesting point. I never noticed that.
Generally, most of saturation I'll do on a mixing level. So this is just a sort of top end sparkle, I guess. From there, I add compression. So a lot of my tracks, it'll be sort of taming the kick, making sure the kick's not
very important,
too thumpy. And yeah, just generally gluing together the track a little bit. I'll have usually at least one compressor that's managing the sort of quick spikes, like for example, the kick, and a second compressor, which is a little bit slower. That's sort of generally gluing the track together a little bit more. And then finally from there, I've got my limiter, which is going to be used to get the sort of desired volume. So Spotify recommend -14 LUFS. A lot of producers do push it a little bit further, -30, -12. It really depends on how much you want to sort of compress the track. But at the very minimum, you want to be looking at an average of -14 LUFS for the track. Otherwise, Spotify is going to have to boost it itself and it's not necessarily going to work. Otherwise, Spotify is going to end up increasing the volume on your track, which is not something that you want them to do because it's not going to be the same sort of quality as if you could do it in your DAW anyway. So yeah, that's a brief sort of summary of the mastering side of things. So yeah, I hope that helps, man. Looking forward to seeing the tips in action. So yeah, over to you.
Okay. Can we just... Oh my gosh. I don't think you guys understand how big this is for me and for you guys as well. I mean, this is a big producer and him giving like step-by-step tips on how he thinks on making and producing songs is honestly, I think, invaluable to beginners, especially people who don't really have a direction, don't know how to approach this. and you're having literally someone who's found so much success in the field breaking it down for you. It's crazy. So big shout out to Mondo Loops for that. That last part about the mastering, honestly, I feel like it got a little technical for me because all I end up doing is just raising the volume to 0. But for those of you who understand compression and multiband compression, whatnot, I feel like that's really helpful. I still don't know how those things work, so that kind of flew over my head. I'll have to look into that. Another thing is Soothe. I saw him using it in a couple of his videos, so I checked it out. I think it's a little bit expensive for beginners, so I would say try it out with the EQ, try out his tips, and then if you feel like you got that down, then maybe move on to Soothe. But as for right now, he also said it himself, but it's not a necessity, right? So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. But yeah, going back to Mondo Loops, huge thanks to him. I mean, it's just so much respect for the guy, right? He's literally all over the field, you know, doing features, creating his own songs. He has like, you know, 1 million subs or 1 million monthly listeners on Spotify. I don't even have to go into every detail for you guys to know how great he is. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I know for those of you guys who, you know, just enjoy seeing me make music, I know this might be a little boring, but I really want you guys to understand that this is really helpful if you really listen. You know, sometimes you just gotta take a step back and listen to what people who know what they're doing are actually saying, right? So, like I said, we're just gonna be covering this reaction, which we did, and then next week, I'll try to put those tips into action, see what I think, see what works, and just pretty much wrap up this series, right? Because originally this week was supposed to be the end, but since we got such a helpful video from, you know, our guy, we're gonna do one more video next week. Yeah, that's pretty much it, I guess. Thanks for watching. See you.